I came away a lot more impressed with Desmond Ridder after watching the All-22 from Week 16. We'll break down some of the plays, why. We'll talk a little bit about Arthur Smith's play calling and why it hasn't been so quarterback friendly. We'll go locked on fullbacks with the latest addition to the Falcons roster and discuss why the nebulous character concerns probably aren't going to hurt Georgia defensive tackle Jalen Carter's draft stock. All on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and a.k.a. the humblest host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own football franchise? Well, this is the game definitely for you. Download the game. Just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners will get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. And guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you will get the video version of the podcast tonight before the audio drops. And make sure you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app, and you'll get Locked On Falcons on your Roku, Amazon Fire TV. So, guys, let's jump into the All-22 discussion from Week 16. And, of course, we'll be focused on Desmond Ridder's performance. And I was very critical of the Falcons' game plan on Saturday evening's rapid reaction. And then after rewatching the game on Sunday night's episode, Monday's audio version of the episode, kind of walked back some of those game criticisms, but was also kind of critical of like some of Desmond Ridder's early game decision making. To me, was a little questionable. And watching the television copy, but watching the All-22, I came away a lot more favorable on Desmond Ridder's performance and some of those key plays. And we'll I'll post some of them on Twitter, on my Twitter on Falcons Fans, and then link to those in the comments below here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And we'll talk about some of those plays. And it was basically a couple of those third downs on the early drives, the second, the third, and the fourth series, that I was like, was Desmond Ridder, should he have gone in a different place on those situations? And those of you that have been listening to this podcast all year long know that when it came to criticisms of Marcus Mariota, most of those criticisms were on those sort of critical down situations like third downs or in the red zone type of things. So let's talk a little bit about those third down issues that I seem to have before watching the All-22. And on the third down on the second series, where Desmond Ridder took a sack instead of throwing the ball away, they ran a high-low concept on that play, and London ran the deeper route. And basically, Ridder's job, is to read the quarterback. And if the read the cornerback. The cornerback is, if he sinks and covers London deep, then that underneath route to Patterson will come open. But Ridder didn't pull the trigger on that because he saw a flash of color from Roquan Smith. And watching it, I was like, well, he could have fit that into Patterson there. But then the thing I noticed on the All-22 was that there was also Justin Houston kind of sinking into the throwing lane, and had Houston reacted in time, he could have sort of jumped that throwing lane and picked that ball off if Ridder had thrown to Patterson. I don't know if Ridder saw Patterson on that play. He definitely saw Roquan Smith. So I look back at that play and say, okay, like, maybe ideally he could have hit that throw, ripped that throw to Patterson. But at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and get mad at him for forcing a throw that could have been a would-be interception in that situation in a tight window. So less of an issue on that particular play. Then you go to the third down on the third series. They ran a concept for Drake London on a crosser, and Ridder scrambled. And I kind of thought initially watching the television, he gave up too early on that play. And then watching back on the All-22, and I probably should have noticed this on the television copy, but of course my eyes were elsewhere. There was pressure on that play, and that's what led to him scrambling and giving up on that concept a little bit too early. So I have no problem with that one. And then the third down on the fourth series, the Falcons ran like a slant flat concept or technical or it was an out pattern rather than a flat route. And Ridder wound up throwing it to Anthony Ferkser, and it was a 3rd and 7. They got a 5-yard gain and then went for it on the 4th and 2. And that was the play that Drake London wound up fumbling on. And behind that, Ferkser's running the slant or the flat or out pattern, and London's running the in-breaking slant route. And so initially I was like, oh, he can throw that ball to London if he just holds it a beat later in that window clears for him. But again, you had an underneath defender kind of sinking into the throwing lane. And given that you had the cornerback playing off, I think Ridder read that one correctly and threw it to Ferkser. And especially if he knew ahead of time going into that down to those 4-down territory, and that if they could get in a 4th and manageable that the team was going to go for it, then going for it and getting the 5-yard completion there to Ferkser to get in that 4th and more manageable was the smart play there. So I had less issues with those plays watching the All-22 than I did, Saturday and Sunday, watching the game live and watching the television copy at that point in time. And so my conclusion watching the All-22, I wouldn't go as far as say, clearly Ridder was not perfect. He missed some throws in the game, but after watching the All-22, similar to last week, I was very comfortable with his processing, his decision-making. Generally, those things were good. Again, he wasn't perfect by any means, but generally very good. He was going through progressions. He was showing anticipation the majority of times. Basically the big issue is he just got to clean up some of the accuracy stuff, throwing behind a couple of receivers. A couple of times they were able to make the adjustments to those throws. Other times they weren't able to make those adjustments. So those are kind of the things that Ridder needs to continue to work on and clean up. But again, I still feel like from the neck up, he's really operating at a much higher level than your sort of typical rookie, even if it doesn't manifest itself into him, completing a high percentage of passes and being a very efficient quarterback. Those things I think will come with time. But, we'll continue talking. We'll wrap up our conversation about the film from week 16, answering a listener question from Keith Guillory at Red Sandman on Twitter. He asked, why does it seem like Arthur Smith protected Mariota, a veteran quarterback, with his play calling, but with Ridder, it seems like there's no real scheme for him. It is more about evaluation than scheming or winning. And Keith, I understand where you're coming from, because again, Saturday I was very vocally critical of Arthur Smith and kind of walked that back, the next day on after reviewing the game. But the simple answer, I think, to your question is this is all part of the evolution that Arthur Smith is undergoing, trying to go from a run offense that they had earlier in the season to a run pass offense. They're still slanted towards running the football, but they're trying to be a little bit more balanced, and they don't want to revert the offense back to where it was in September. And I do think that has the benefit of being more useful in trying to evaluate Desmond Ridder than just basing it off of like, okay, this is what we would run if he was the starter in September. No, it's like we're still going to run the offense that we want to run in December, even if Ridder is basically at the September phase of his development. And again, like I did Saturday, I think it's fair to criticize that you could be helping your rookie quarterback a lot more. In this situation. But I do think it does speak to the level of confidence that this regime does have in Desmond Ridder, especially in comparison to what I think the perception is from outsiders, which is largely based on the idea that, well, Ridder's a 3rd-round pick and 3rd-round quarterbacks typically do not succeed in the NFL. And so people sort of assume that Ridder will fall under that same sort of category. And also coupled with the idea that, why did they wait so long to bench Marcus Mariota? It must be, that conclusion that a lot of people reach that, we've dispelled on this podcast, or tried to, that, they waited on they waited because they didn't have confidence in Ridder. And I think it's all part of their process in terms of like they have a plan with Desmond Ridder, and this is only the beginning of it. This is only phase 1 or maybe phase 2 of that plan, but there's like 3 or 4 phases, and potentially phase 3 would be in this analogy is him starting next year, but we'll sort of see on that. And again, I'm willing to back off some of the criticisms I had on Saturday immediately after the game for Arthur Smith, but others I probably won't back off, particularly like, this week against Arizona. Just, you know, can you do me a solid, Arthur? I know you're listening. I know you make Locked On Falcons your first listen. So please just do me a solid. And, on the first 2 plays, again, you don't have to do it on play number 1, but at least within the first 2 plays of the game, script up a run to Tyler Algier to the right. Just run it to the right with Tyler Algier. If you do that in the first 2 plays, we're good. We're good, Arthur. Like, do me that solid. That's all I want. And I think most of the people listening would be like, yeah, we would greatly appreciate that in this Arizona game script, which we did not get in the Baltimore game script. So please help a brother out. But that's where we're going to leave the all-22 conversation on today's episode, guys. And we'll get into Locked On Fullbacks. It's been a while since we've been Locked On Fullbacks here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, because the Falcons just signed a fullback, and that will allow us to wax poetic about, the future of the fullback position in this offense, and, what this signing means and could indicate moving forward for this football team. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about today's sponsor. That is the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. And if you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM or managing your own football franchise, well, that dream has finally come true. This is the game definitely for you. You manage every aspect of your team, from hiring the coaches and coordinators, trading players, drafting players, signing free agents. The challenges are real. They ask you sort of to set your expectations for a season. And as I've said before, like my first season, I was feeling pretty confident that, we're going to win at least 6 games. We don't need to set the expectations for a true rebuild. And then we start the season 2-1, and I'm like, okay, I'm feeling great. This game's going to be easy, right? Then we lose 11 straight, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to get fired. So, like, if you're up for such challenges, if you're the type that loves, tinkering with rosters, this is definitely the game for you. And you can do so by downloading the game in the App Store or going to ultimate-gm.com. And when you download the app, you'll get a 100% free boost to your franchise by using our promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. Again, that's promo code Locked On. Remember, download the game at ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. And guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And for your second listen, why not check out Locked On Sports Today? Go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with the local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide by subscribing to Locked On Sports Today, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So, guys, let's go Locked On Fullbacks on today's episode, because the Falcons added a fullback to their practice squad today. Former Northern Illinois fullback Clint Ratkovich. He's an interesting player because he was, relatively speaking, again, he's a fullback, so it's not as if he was a high value prospect, but some people saw him as one of the better fullbacks in this past year's draft. And then he tore his ACL at the Packers local pro day this past April, and now seemingly has rehabbed fully from that. Now what, 8.5 months later, and seems ready to pick up where he should have been, probably an undrafted free agent this past April. And so, he was a player that, did have his actual pro day at Northern Illinois prior to that local pro day and tested very well. And because of those favorable athletic comparisons, some people were comparing him to Kyle Juszczyk, and Dane Brugler in his Beast draft guide this past year wrote, overall, Ratkovich is on the same level as 49ers Kyle Juszczyk, but he has the versatility to play a similar role and make an immediate impact on special team. And this, to me, is a further indicator, or something that we've talked about earlier this season on Locked On Falcons, in talking about Keith Smith and probably the likelihood, who is an impending free agent this offseason, that we probably will not see Keith Smith returning. He's going to turn 31 in April this year. And Smith has been adequate this year, but I don't think his blocking has been anything to write home about this year, especially over the last several weeks. Like, I think there was a stretch of games around that Browns game where he did block really well in those games, but since then it's been kind of ho-hum based off of my film study. And then I think the other thing that really hurts Keith Smith's potential to be re-signed this offseason is that his special teams production has fallen off a cliff this year, right? That in the 3 previous years he was in Atlanta, he was averaging about 6 special teams tackles a year, and this year he only has 1. And so that's pretty replaceable, if you ask me. And so, going back to a conversation we were having very early in the season, it was interesting to me to watch the film where the Falcons were asking Keith Smith to line up more as an inline tight end H-back type of player than they had traditionally done. Like, if you look at the first 5 games of the season, according to Pro Football Focus, 27% of Keith Smith's snaps saw him line up inline. And then you look at the 10 games since then, it's been about 6% of his snaps. And the other interesting thing is you've seen a lot of Parker Hesse lined up in the backfield as that sort of fullback. About 15% of his snaps have lined up there. We've also touched upon the idea of John Fitzpatrick potentially, returning next year, and maybe we'll get him back off the injured reserve at some point before the end of this season. But one of the things we talked about when we were scouting John Fitzpatrick 6 months ago was the idea, in particularly in comparing him to Parker Hesse, that Hesse was more of a true inline wide tight end, blocking tight end, and Fitzpatrick, at least based off of how he was utilized in Georgia, was more of that H-back type of player that was offset the line of scrimmage. It could potentially line up in the backfield and block better in space. And that's kind of what I think I could imagine the Falcons looking for in this sort of Keith Smith role. So I do feel like if, with Hesse coming back, with Fitzpatrick coming back, you have at least 2 options there to kind of fill more of that fullback role that the Falcons, at least early in the season, were looking for Keith Smith to provide. And then you couple that with Ratkovich. You also still have John Rainey on the practice squad. I feel like the Falcons are preparing themselves to move on from Keith Smith this offseason. So if we are going to witness the last 2 games that Keith Smith plays in Atlanta, I think he's had a solid run here in Atlanta. And certainly when you compare these 3 or 4 years that we had with Keith Smith at the fullback position compared to the previous years in the post DeMarco years, like 2018, 2019, or 2017, 2018, Keith Smith was kind of a lifesaver for us to give us competent fullback play, at that position. But, it's interesting. One of the things I'm excited to watch because of the potential of moving on from Keith Smith is, actually evaluating fullbacks. Me and Locked On Fullbacks, we love to do this stuff. And, what's interesting with the Kyle Juszczyk stuff is, like, one of the things that Kyle Shanahan does with Juszczyk a lot is asking him to line up, all over the place, not only in the backfield, but also is an inline tight end. On average, the last 5 years, about 15% of his snaps have come in as that sort of inline player. And obviously, he's going to be the player that often gets compared to when you think about the premier fullbacks in the NFL, because he's been to 7 consecutive Pro Bowls because of his versatility, not only as a pass catcher, as a runner, and being able to be this blocker that can play in multiple areas of your offense. And what's going to be interesting this offseason, you're going to probably, the player that's going to get those comps, if Ratkovich was getting those comps last year, you'll probably hear that for Hunter Lipke, the North Dakota State running back / fullback / tight end type of player. And, you can kind of see it, particularly with Lipke as a pass catcher, more so than the blocking and running stuff when it compares to Juszczyk. But, for those of you guys that are interested in Hunter Lipke and interested in, the 4 of you that are also, big fans of Locked On Fullbacks here on the Locked On Podcast Network, check out the FCS championship game on January 8th, I think it is, North Dakota State versus South Dakota State. And so if you find yourself wanting to watch football that day and watching that game, North Dakota State, check out Hunter Lipke. He's, I think, they use him as basically their power running back, their short yardage running back. So that will allow you to see some of what he can do. And then for South Dakota State, they have a tight end named Tucker Kraft, who is projected by some people to be a top 50 pick, could be, or a second round sort of pick. And I could see the Falcons looking at him to be sort of an upgrade over Anthony Ferkser as their tight end 2 behind Kyle Pitts. If, say, on that day 2 range. Again, I know it's crazy to think that the Falcons would draft a tight end again that high, but Falcon's gonna Falcon. And what's interesting about Tucker Kraft is, he's like the South Dakota version of Troy Anderson, where he was like this multi-sport star in South Dakota, but because he went to high school in South Dakota, like, no one had heard of him. He wasn't highly recruited, similar to how Troy Anderson was like all state, track athlete and football player in Montana, but because it's Montana, like, he wasn't nationally recruited or something like that. So Tucker Kraft's going to be another guy. I know he was dealing with some injuries earlier this year, but January 8th, watch the FCS title game between, North Dakota State and South Dakota State. And there may be 2 potential future Falcons playing in that game. So that will be an excuse for you guys to check that out. But we will talk a little bit more about the draft and talk mostly about Jalen Carter and the idea that he could potentially fall in this year's draft because of character concerns, which I don't think are really going to be an issue, but we'll discuss some of the reasons why, those issues surround Jalen Carter as we wrap up today's episode, guys. But before we get there, I want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a new slate of podcasts that we're sure you're going to love. Check out an episode of The League, available as a bonus episode right now on Locked On NFL, narrated by Super Bowl champion Richard Sherman and sports broadcaster Taylor Rooks. The League is an 8-part docuseries about the most bizarre, inspirational, and untold stories connected to America's favorite sport, spanning from the 1940s through the present. Each story offers equal parts history, entertainment, and social commentary. Our bonus episode is called The Way of the Cowboy, and it is an incredible story of how the 1977 Dallas Cowboys brought in Bruce Lee's protege to teach the defense martial arts, ushering in a new approach to how the league trains. Head over to Locked On NFL for that bonus episode of The League right now, or catch the full series for free on Audible or wherever you get your podcasts. Audible, get in the game. So our last question of the day comes from Diquavius Targaryen, first of his name, at Padre1013 on Twitter. He asked, do you feel that the Jalen Carter locker room cancer story will be enough to cause him to fall to us if our current draft position holds for the rest of the season? And of course, as we discussed 2 days ago on Mock Draft Monday, we talked about the Falcons holding the 7th pick as of that recording, but due to the games that were coming, they could move up in the draft. So technically, as of this recording, they are picking 6th in the draft. And for those of you that don't know what Diquavius, first of his name, is referring to, this goes back to something Todd McShay said on ESPN 2 weeks ago, and I'll read you the quote is, there are some character issues, involving Carter, that is. Does he get along with everybody? What's he like to deal with in the locker room? Those sorts of issues. I know it's early in the process, but I'm forewarning everyone out there. Carter's going to be the hot button name when we talk about some of the intangible aspects of it. That will be a big discussion. It's not about his talent. It's not about his size. It's not about his explosive takeoff or finishing as a pass rusher. It's about the character, and do we want to bring that guy into the building? So for further background, Todd McShay is kind of infamous, for doing this pretty much every year, right? You go back to last year, he was one of the early people pushing the Kayvon Thibodeau character issues in around the Senior Bowl time. He wrote something around the lines of like, he wouldn't be shocked if Thibodeau fell out of the top 5. Thibodeau wound up going 5th overall, so he did not fall out of the top 5. And then the previous year, Micah Parsons was labeled by Todd McShay as the best defensive player in the draft, but the off-field issues / character stuff is going to cause him to fall a bit. And technically you can say that did happen because Parsons wound up going 12th. But I think in the context in which Todd McShay was talking about specifically when he was quoted as that, he was talking about in the context of Parsons falling at the top 15. And obviously he did not do that. So, as far as Carter and whatever nebulous character issues that Todd McShay is referring to from his sources, I don't think Todd McShay is making this up, but certainly you can argue that, maybe these, having learned his lesson from the last couple of years, that maybe these aren't things that are really worth bringing up because they don't seem to have major impact on the draft stock of guys like Thibodeau and Micah Parsons enough to really knock them, and probably won't with Jalen Carter. So I would say you could probably take it with a grain of salt, but I don't really see this affecting Carter's stock too much because like the 2 things that really affect draft stock are character issues and injury stuff. But when it comes to character, especially with the top prospects and someone like a Jalen Carter, like I don't think those things really impact their draft stock nearly to the degree that I think a lot of people would assume they would. Like to me, the thing that's going to hurt Jalen Carter more than anything else than necessarily character stuff is like if his measurables are off, right? And like that doesn't seem to be the case from like a height weight standpoint, because like the average D tackle size is like 6'3", 305, and Carter's basically that size, give or take, probably a few pounds. Like if he measures like 31-inch arms, like that would hurt Jalen Carter a lot more. And then all of a sudden, you like, people were like, well, he's undersized or short armed, or he's got T-Rex arms, and then you couple that with the character stuff, like that's going to hurt him. Like I can think of Geno Atkins, right? Going back to another Georgia prospect from a dozen years ago, and I remember being really high on Geno Atkins coming off his, like, I think his junior year, and thinking, oh, this is a future first round pick. But obviously Geno Atkins wound up falling to the fourth round. He didn't play as much his senior year as I think a lot of us thought he would. He was more of a rotational player. And one of the things I remember hearing about that was like he kind of clashed with the Georgia coaching staff back then. I think that was Mark Richt and them. And like that was why he didn't play as much as he should have played based off of his talent level. So maybe those are character issues, but I honestly think the thing that hurt Geno Atkins more than anything was like the fact that he was like 6'1", more so than these character issues, right? And we saw that several years later with Grady Jarrett going in the fifth round, where a lot of people were convinced that he was one of like the best 75 prospects in that draft class. And recently is not the same, but like generally speaking, NFL teams do not like short D tackles. And so I think that hurt Geno Atkins more. And so that's what I mean, where like arm length could hurt Jalen Carter a lot more than character. If you have character concerns, and then you also have like physical limitations that the perception would be like if he runs a 5'3" or something like that in the 40, those types of things, I think will hurt. The character stuff will be a lot more meaningful at that point. Basically, for me, from a character standpoint, the only thing that's going to really hurt Jalen Carter is like if he tests positive for marijuana at the combine, or he blows off a meeting with a team or something like that. And probably that's only going to hurt him on that team's board. And unless that's, a team picking in the top 3, like your top 5, and it's probably not going to cause him to fall. Generally speaking, NFL teams are very willing. We know history kind of tells us that the NFL teams are very willing to overlook character issues if they believe the player is talented enough. And right now, piggybacking off something that Todd McShay said, there's no reason to think that the talent level is a concern, and so they will be willing to overlook. It's the hubris of NFL teams basically saying like, oh, like our culture, our locker room is strong enough that we can handle a guy like Jalen Carter. So, obviously you have extreme examples like La'el Collins and Laramie Tunsil of guys that fell, because of things that happened like the day of the draft, and teams were like, La'el Collins, for those of you who don't recall, was under investigation for like a murder the day of the draft. Not to make light of that, but like something that extreme. Or Laramie Tunsil's famous or infamous for, the smoking gas mask video that dropped like an hour before the draft. That caused him to fall, out of the top 5 in that draft. But basically you have to have like extreme things like that. Like as long as a player does not have like an arrest on his record, like the character stuff, I think tends to get overlooked. It's really the injuries that that impact draft stock, I think, a lot more than character stuff, particularly for the higher level players. I think, like basically the way I would describe it is like if you hear a story, oh, Jalen Carter, breaking news, Jalen Carter was involved in a street brawl, that's going to be less detrimental than hearing the headline, Jalen Carter involved in a street brawl and breaks his leg in the street brawl. Like NFL teams are going to be much more worried about his availability than, these sort of nebulous character stuff. So I don't see him falling that far in the draft. Again, it will, to me, where he gets picked will basically depend on who's picking and what those teams' needs are and the quarterback situation of those teams. We know Chicago, we know Arizona are going to have high picks. They're not taking quarterbacks that high. And so essentially for the Falcons, that is, if you're dreaming of Jalen Carter, you're probably not going to get ahead of Chicago, but you kind of need to get ahead of Arizona in the draft. And so therefore this weekend's game between the Falcons and Cardinals is potentially, the Jalen Carter game, if you want to look at it that way. And so we'll see how that goes. But I'll go on the record and say I like our chances. We'll be doing crossover Thursday tomorrow with Locked On Cardinals host Alex Clancy. But I'll say ahead of time that I do like the Falcons' chances this week at home against the Cardinals, against a backup quarterback that the Cardinals will have, whether it's Colt McCoy out of concussion protocol or Trace McSorley, and, this offense facing a bottom 10 defense, right? The Cardinals are 25th in defensive DVOA according to Football Outsiders. And currently, when you look at currently ranked bottom 10 defenses according to Football Outsiders, the Falcons have a 4-1 record against those teams this year. So I like the Falcons' chances against it. And so I think if the Falcons were to lose to Arizona this weekend, the positive is, they're one step closer to getting Jalen Carter, I would argue. But, that would probably be the biggest blow to Desmond Ridder being the Falcons quarterback next year than anything else, because this is by far the most winnable game for this team the rest of this in this final 4-game stretch. And so if they do not win this game, and if Ridder performs poorly against the Cardinals defense, then that would be a significant blow to his potential. But based off of what I've seen the last couple of weeks, I feel optimistic. I won't say confident. You can never feel confident about the Falcons. I'll be optimistic that the Falcons will take care of business on Sunday. But again, as we just discussed for the last 10 minutes, I'm sure some of you are like, no, why? Like, now we're in the chance to get Jalen Carter, and Desmond Ridder's going to ruin it all. And guys, I don't know why you guys still continue to do this. I've been telling this for years. Falcon's going to Falcon, man. Like, whatever you want to have happen, they're going to do the opposite. And so you just got to get used to it. Just set your expectations low. So be excited for the Ridder-sance and disappointed by the Carter, but yeah, you never know. There's a chance. Maybe there's a chance that Ridder can win this game, become the Falcons starting quarterback, and we'll find a way to get Jalen Carter next April. So again, hope springs eternal. We're turning a new page here on Locked On Falcons, dreaming of better days, but we'll see. I wouldn't hold my breath, but we'll see. So guys, that will do it for us on today's episode. We'll be back tomorrow for a crossover Thursday. Make sure you make us your first listen then, and also for your second listen today and also tomorrow. Check out Locked On Sports Today. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta. If you want to submit questions for future Q&As, we got plenty to do, because no one cares about the season anymore. It's just the Desmond Ridder show. Like, is he good? And that's about it. Of course, you can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here in the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below. Guys, really appreciate it. Till then.